Hello, my name is Marcia Dunbar, and I am very excited to be a moderator for the Six Bridges Book Festival this evening. I have the honor of moderating for Shea Tuttle, the author of Exactly As You Are, The Life and Faith of Mr. Rogers. As you can see, I really enjoyed this book, so I'm very excited to be able to hear from her and to share with you all her thoughts while writing this book. So throughout this evening, please feel free to ask questions. And Shea, there you are. Thank you for joining us.
Yes. Thank you.
We're so excited to have you. Now, I know that you are a graduate of the Chandler School of Theology from Emory University, yes?
Yes.
If you could tell, and I know that you co-authored a book, which by the title alone, I just knew, I was like, okay, that's my next read, because it just sounded, tell us a little bit about it.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm a co-editor of a book called Can I Get a Witness? It has a mouthful of a subtitle. It's 13 Peacemakers, Community Builders, and Agitators for Faith and Justice. So that book was a project out of the Project on Lives Theology at the University of Virginia, where I worked for 7.5 or so years. And I got to work on that project with Charles Marsh and Dan Rhodes. And it basically takes 13 chapter-long stories of people who worked for social change in the United States on the basis of their faith. So it's a very different book from this one, but a great resource. I know some church groups and classes and things have had some good discussions with that. So it's a good one to check out.
Well, I feel like you're definitely a powerhouse. You are a graduate of Emory. You are a author, and you're a mom during a pandemic. I know that you're navigating a lot of different waters right now, right?
Yeah.
So that's great. Why don't we begin with a reading from your book, and then I have so many questions, so I want to kind of hold off and let everybody participating have their chance.
That sounds great. So I'll just read a little bit from the introduction just to kind of set the stage a little bit. So the introduction, each chapter in the book has an epigraph that comes from one of the songs that Fred Rogers wrote. And this epigraph is just, "Why, hi, don't I know you?" Which comes from a song he wrote with Josie Carey for the Children's Corner. So this is just the beginning of the introduction. Weekday afternoons when I was a child often found me curled up on the brown plaid couch in our basement family room, draped in a homely single yarn brown afghan, my fingers poking through its open knit. I'd settle in as the opening sequence unfolded, the aerial view of the neighborhood giving way to a zoom shot of the house's exterior, the camera then cutting inside to the living room and panning toward the front door through which a slender man entered with purpose, met my eyes for the first time, and smiled. The ascending piano chords, then the song, familiar as a prayer. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? As he sang, he hung his blazer in the closet and put on a zippered sweater, then sat down and swapped his loafers for a pair of navy canvas sneakers by the time the song ended. "Hello, neighbor," he'd greet me. "Hello, Mr. Rogers," I'd reply. On many of our visits, he'd bring something with him, maybe pretzels, wooden blocks, or a musical instrument. He'd tell me a little bit about whatever it was before getting interrupted by a knock at the door or a phone call, which would often bring an invitation that would take us out into the neighborhood to visit the bakery or the music store, a restaurant, or an arts center. Later in the program, once we had returned to the house, Mr. Rogers would say, "Let's have some make-believe," and remind me of what was transpiring when last we visited the neighborhood of make-believe, where a motley crew of people and puppets made their way through neighborhood politics, personal insecurities, and more. Mr. Rogers would summon Trolley, the cheerful red streetcar who guided the transition into make-believe, and I, from my corner of the couch, would let out a sigh. I preferred the segments of the show in Mr. Rogers' company to the interlude in make-believe, but only a small sigh because I knew that in just a few minutes, Trolley would faithfully return me to that living room and to Mr. Rogers. Then we would sing a little and talk about what we did that day and what we would do tomorrow. We'd acknowledge the wonderful ways I was growing, the good feelings that gave me, and my astonishing singularity in the world. And then we would say goodbye until tomorrow. Over the years, I grew out of the neighborhood. I forgot the storylines and many of the songs, but I remembered the man, and I remembered how he and his program made me feel completely seen, completely loved. I cannot recall the precise origin of my affection for Mr. Rogers, and I cannot quite explain its intensity. I just know that he is indescribably special to me. I feel as if I have always known him, like he was a part of my becoming. It is not simple nostalgia, fleeting and saccharine. It is deeper than nostalgia. It is formation. It is love. I'll stop there.
Well, that particular reading was right off the top, and it was one of my favorites because you could feel so much emotion behind your words.
Mm.
And so as I was reading those very words, I was like, this has to be the reason that spoke to her, this kinship with Fred Rogers and how he impacted your life. And so could you speak more into that as to with all the things about Mr. Rogers out there now, like what spurred you to want to write this book?
Yeah, so I think I mean, as I wrote, I adored him as a child. I remember that I would cry anytime I had to miss the neighborhood for the day, and that isn't necessarily to indicate I had particularly good taste, because I think I also cried about missing Pee-wee's Playhouse, but I think Mr. Rogers'
Fair
Neighborhood
enough.
was a little more, yeah, was a little more significant to me. And I think I kind of never left that fascination with him behind, even though, as I said, I grew out of the neighborhood. I didn't continue to watch, but I continued to find him just really captivating. And I remember coming across the profile of him in Esquire magazine written by Tom Junot. It's the basis of what became the Tom Hanks feature film. But I came across that, it was written in 98 and I did not come across it then, but probably somewhere around 2011, 2012. I read that piece and I think it reignited my curiosity and made me think like, oh, there's something really significant about this person. So I think that it just sort of simmered in my mind. And actually, when I was working on the Can I Get a Witness book, I sort of thought about like Charles Marsh, who was a co-editor on that, asked me like, if you were going to write about somebody for the book, who would it be? And it was just, I don't know. I'm not really a historian. I don't know a lot of like historical stuff. But there was some point when I realized like, oh my gosh, I think I would look into Mr. Rogers. And so that, again, the idea just kind of percolated. And at some point I dove in and realized there's so much to say about this person. And I thought it might be an essay, and then it kept growing and eventually became a book. So yeah, I don't know. It just kind of an enduring fascination, I think.
Well, I'm so glad it led to this book because I think it's touched a lot of people's lives. I know that it certainly moved me, especially in this day and time. It seems like we all need a little more Fred now more than ever. And some of those storylines, how do you feel like the storylines read true today?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that rings true. I mean, I know that, gosh, I mean, he was always dealing with so many issues at once and so many layers. So he would be trying to respond to issues that are very daily in the lives of children, that are still very daily in the lives of children, experiencing change or different kinds of separation or fears or different things that happen in your growing. But all of those things would have parallels with whatever was happening in the world at the time. And well, I think it's really easy for us to feel right now like, oh my gosh, the world has never been this sort of chaotic or this overwhelming or this frightening. There are many times that have been chaotic and frightening. And his very first week of programming was in 1968. And that was a time of enormous upheaval in our country and around the world. And so, he would, the first week of programming, for instance, it really dealt with, the storyline had to do with war, but the occasion for the threat of war was that things were changing and the king didn't like things changing. And so he literally built a border fence around the castle because he was afraid of change. Exactly, right? It's very prescient in so many ways. But I think that's also because so many of these things have always been with us. Fear of change has led adults to war for as long as we've existed. And so I think for Fred, there was this need to, if I'm going to work to create a world where adults don't make war because they're afraid of change, then I have to help children understand how to deal with change. And so he was always doing that. He was always, I think, putting all of these things together and creating these very intricate, sometimes odd, but these storylines that would have these kind of almost dreamlike resonances across the course of the week. And they were very creative, and they really did touch on so many things, I think, for people of all ages and in so many different times as they've continued to have power even well beyond, his death. So it's pretty fascinating.
It really is. And the way, when you mentioned the layers, the way in which that he could have that commonality throughout an entire episode, showing a glass blower in comparison to what was going on. It was always fascinating to me as a child. Everything was very layered and purposeful.
Yeah.
So, and you spoke to that in this book too, is that he was as playful and joyful as he was also very methodical.
That's right.
And I learned from you, I had no idea about his childhood and how formative it was into making who he was today. I mean, we all have that, but those moments, can you tell us a few things that kind of stuck out to help him realize the need to appeal to children on their level?
Yeah. So I think he had kind of a difficult childhood. I mean, he was very fortunate to have a loving family. He had, tons of privilege in that he was, the oldest for a long time only, but always oldest child of a very wealthy family, very prominent family in town, white male, all of these things that sort of confer power. And he was sick a lot as a child. He had really bad hay fever and allergies, a number of illnesses throughout his childhood. And he also had, he was bullied. I think he was an odd kid. He was lonely and shy. He had as you might imagine, a very vivid, imaginative world, and would play through a lot of his feelings. He was very musical. He played piano at a very young age, but I think he was odd and kind of awkward. And so he was bullied around age 8. He also talks about that around that age, he was somewhat overweight, and he got bullied. There's a story he tells about a bunch of bullies at school calling him Fat Freddy and chasing him home basically after school. So he had experienced some kinds of hardship as a child. And I think he made a point of remembering that as he grew. One of his mentors, Margaret McFarland, was an expert in child development, and he met with her weekly for as long as she was alive and healthy and able, to talk about his ideas for the neighborhood program, because he wanted to make sure the program was developmentally appropriate and savvy. And she said that Fred's special gift was that he didn't forget what it was like to be a child. So I think he held on to some of those memories of that vulnerability and really carried that into his work with children. He also had parents who were very involved in the community and very generous. I mean, they were very wealthy, but they used that wealth for the community. And I think that was a model to him, that you use the gifts that you have for the sake of others. So that was a big part of his life in growing up. And I think what kind of hand in glove with that went his experience growing up in church. And so, his faith was always very important to him. And that was formed in him at a young age as well.
I found it interesting that coming from the point where he was bullied, he also, one of those bullies ended up befriending him and kind of transformed him, and he blossomed out of that friendship from his friend being in the hospital, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was kind of fascinating as to how things play out in our lives and the impact that they have, and how transformative that was for him.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he was like, I don't know if I chose, or if he chose to take the boy that was in the hospital to homework, or
Right.
or someone told him to, but it's one of those, I was like, yeah, everything happens for a reason. That was one of those moments where and we do have a great question from Kristen.
Mhm.
She would like to know, what kind of show do you think Fred Rogers might create today, even this week, to help children navigate the particular issues weighing on our country today? No
Yeah.
pressure.
Right, right. Yeah, I think it would, man, it would be a tall order. I've often wondered kind of how he would engage the things that are happening now. In ways, I think it's a shame that we don't have him, to sort of I would love to know what he would make of some of what we see. I think there are a few things we know about what he valued. One is that it was always important to him when there were times of crisis in our country, after 9/11, for instance, or really anytime there was some sort of big upheaval, when he would be interviewed and be asked for his advice, he would say, your children need to know that you're going to take care of them and that they're going to be okay. And I think it's in the documentary about him that Susan Stambaugh, I think is her name. She's if I'm remembering the right name, but she's a public radio personality. She said there were times she was uncomfortable with that advice because I can't promise my children that I'm necessarily going to be okay and be able to take care of them. But for him, that was very important that we reassure children in that way. He also was clear about it being important to keep consistency in children's lives. So during the Gulf War, he sent out his company, or his family communications nonprofit, sent out a memo to PBS stations across the country saying, please keep your programming schedules for children the same. Children rely on consistency, especially in times of upheaval. So that was very interesting. And then I had another thought that I lost. It was also important to him, though, on the other hand, that adults share with the children in their lives when they were going through something difficult. So he felt that children are going to sense that from you whether or not you talk with them. So find ways that are developmentally appropriate to talk to them. Find ways to share your grief with them if you're grieving. Because if children feel it, but you don't explain it, then they're going to feel worse because there isn't a way to share that. So I think he would be searching for ways to share with children both the reassurance that, people always recall the look for the helpers language, which I think was for children. It wasn't for adults. Adults have to be the helpers. But that he would have tried to do both of those things of reassuring and trying to share with them what was going on. He didn't shy away from the hard topics. He talked about lots of hard topics with children. He talked about death. He talked about what it's like to go through a divorce in your family. He talked about assassination. I mean, he found ways to talk about many difficult things. So I think it would be both.
Yes, and one of the memories that I had, the most poignant for me, is when the foot washing in the pool out front with the officer, and he was like, "Come on over," and I can't think of his name right now. I know
Officer
it.
Clemens. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yes,
Officer
yes.
Clemens.
Yes, Officer Clemens.
Mhm.
And what a beautiful moment that was. And the pause in the moment. That was one thing that I would love to have shown, is the pause in the moment where he looked at the camera. And you just knew, like, this is okay. And he always had a way. He was very honest with his feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And he made his viewers, which you pointed out, feel like they were the only person. He spoke to that one person when he moved into TV to make sure that they knew. One of the things that I highlighted was also in whimsy and seriousness on the children's corner, when he said, I guess it all comes, it was during a moment when someone reached out to him to partner in a program. And he said, I guess it all comes down from knowing that someone you like is thinking about you.
Mm-hmm.
And he always had a way of making you feel like that was what was going on. And so
Yeah.
I just love that moment. He also had a seminary degree, and a lot of people don't know that. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so coming out of college, his plan was to go straight to seminary. And then it was during the Easter vacation of his last year of college, he went to He went home to visit his parents on the break, and they had a new TV. It was one of the first in town. And they were showing it to him like, hey, you got to check this out. And I don't know if it was really the first time he ever saw television, but that's kind of the way he tells the story, that you sat down to look and they're flipping through, what must have been 3 channels or something, I don't know. And they came to something that was supposed to be a children's program. And what he saw horrified him. There were people throwing pies in each other's faces. And he found that awful. He thought it was demeaning, and he thought that was insulting both to the people in it, but also insulting to children, to think that that's what children most want to see. And, my kids would love to see that. I know that kids enjoy it, but for him, it was like, this is not respecting anybody, including the children. So anyway, he decided then, again, in his telling, it was like right in that moment, he said to his parents, I don't think I'll go to seminary, maybe later, but I think I'm going to go into television. And they were like, you've never even seen the television. He was like, I've seen enough. I'm going to go.
Enough.
Yeah. So he did. And, but I think the interest in seminary and the interest in theology wasn't gone. And so a number of years later, while he was working on the Children's Corner, he started taking classes, and he took them one class at a time. I think started out taking a class like on his lunch hour. So he would be at the station in the morning planning for the Children's Corner, the show that was kind of a precursor to the neighborhood. And then he would drive like mad across town. Some of his colleagues once commented that he drove a little too fast in general. So he was on the move kind of guy. Yeah. So he would zoom across town and take his class and then zoom back and continue his work on the Children's Corner. So it took him 8 years to finish the degree, but he did. And he was ordained, and he maintained that ordination throughout his life. It seems to have been important to him, even though he never served a church in the sort of, a specific congregation. But he was ordained with this specific charge to minister to children and families through the mass media. And so he took that seriously, and that's what he tried to do.
I had highlighted something you wrote. If we are going to develop generations of emotionally intelligent adults, we must address the emotional needs of the children who will become them. Mm-hmm. He was truly on the forefront of that.
He was.
So do you see, with the impact that he has had on television, do you see Fred Rogers in today's children's programming?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think he was one of the very early people to be thinking about that. He really hated cartoons for the most part. I mean, he there's some point when he was working on a short-term television project, I think in the Soviet Union. That may not be correct, but somewhere. And the people he was working with in this other country said to him, like, we want to make something like Tom and Jerry. And he, in his very Mr. Rogers gentle but direct way, was like, I don't like Tom and Jerry. It was like, no. And I think he really hated, like, if you think about like Roadrunner and Coyote, I mean, those kinds of cartoons that, I grew up liking those things. I still find them kind of clever. But the idea of like, the whole point was just to like trick each other and like destroy each other. And, people would get flattened in one scene and then they're back and they're running around. And he hated that stuff because it was violent in his view. It wasn't true to life. I think it had that kind of bullying quality that he was very sensitive to as someone who was bullied as a child. So when I think about, those types of shows being what were on during his time working and in my childhood, and then I think about there's certainly garbage out there that children watch, but when I think about the vast majority of children's programming now that's aiming to educate in all sorts of different ways. I mean, sometimes it's sort of STEM education, which is fine, but also that there are all of these ways that shows are trying to provide emotional education. And really, when I think about like, there are times that I thought my own children are 7 and 10, and when I think about some of their like foundational, even movie experiences, like they grew up on, or they're growing up on movies like Frozen that are all kind of about like, love of each other and female empowerment and like strength in your person, all these kinds of things that were not quite the messages of The Little Mermaid, which was like what I was watching as a child. And so I really do think, I don't know that I'm sure he's an influence for all of those things, but I think he was really one of the first to be thinking very intentionally about what are the messages we want our children to have, and then how do we do that in a way that really engages them. Um, he might not love the pace of children's programming now in a lot of cases, but I think about, again, like movies like Zootopia are brilliant in the ways that they're talking to children about difference, and about what it means to be community, which for him was neighborhood. So yeah, I think there are definite ways that his influence is everywhere now in the ways that we entertain children,
Some of the backstories that you offered were absolutely amazing to me. Just to know what was going on in the background. Something so simple as feeding fish. Like I had
Right.
no idea. So could you share with everyone like just that small moment and how intentional he was at making sure that he listened to children and fed into them really?
Yeah. I mean, I think he was remarkably intentional about so many things, and I think that's what made him really excellent at his work. I also think it probably made him sometimes a huge pain for the people that he worked with, because he was so like exacting. This has to be exactly right, and it wasn't done until he said it was done. It was very important to him that every choice be well considered. So that the goldfish story is that he every day, that was a part of the whole show, had a routine, and if you watched it, you probably remember some of those aspects, but
Yeah.
the entry, the music, the song, the shoes, the sweater, all of these things. But then at some point he would always feed the fish, and at some point you would go to make believe, and these different things that would happen. These sort of rituals of the show, they also evolved over time as he learned different things or heard feedback. And so at some point, at least the story goes, that he got a letter from a child or the family of that child who was blind and who would sometimes worry, did you remember to feed the fish? And so from then on, he would say something to indicate, oh, let's give the fish some food, or something so that that child and any other children who couldn't watch him would know the fish are taken care of. So he really did take all of that very seriously.
And the reassurance for these children, I'll be back when the day is new.
That's
and
right.
I'll have more idea, like constantly letting them know that there's stability out there, and how important that was for now so many children who may not have that stability.
That's right. Yeah, and there were a number of people who reached out to him as adults or as teenagers or whatever, who would send him a letter to say, my childhood was, abusive, or it was frightening, or it was unstable, but you showed me that there were other ways of being, that there were other realities beyond my home, and that was very moving to him and very inspiring of his work as well.
So I have to touch on the point that we're gushing about him because he was so fantastical. I mean, he really was kind of otherworldly here on Earth. And in reading your book and learning other things, his wife was always, on the point of bringing it down a notch, and so, well, he's real, like he's like everybody else,
right,
and things like that. And you had spoken in your book, contrasting how different he was, how whimsical but methodical, and kind of talking about the juxtaposition of these two contrasting things, but always present for him. And something that I thought was fascinating is the way that he found liturgy in his life, the repetition of the things that he did. What was the most unique to you? Like what was the thing that stood out when writing this book to you about Mr. Rogers?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think what stood out to me most of all was just how incredibly methodical he was. I mean, I think that, and I'm not a person who's very methodical or disciplined, and so I think for me that's sort of like, wait, what? Like that he was so consistent about so many things. He had these kind of rituals in his own life of he woke up early every day. He, in some order or another, would have kind of time of reading the Bible and prayer time. He had a long list of people that he prayed for by name. At some point every day he would swim. I heard that it was an hour, and I heard that it was a mile, and maybe it was, I don't know. But he swam almost every day of his adult life. Once he sort of started, that was something he committed to himself to do. And one of the stories I like was that I think Amy Hollingsworth tells the story that he would stand on the side of the pool and sing Jubilate Deo, if you know that song. It's just a little short song before his swim. So I think it was a kind of a spiritual practice for him. I think it was also an emotional outlet. It also, I think, probably guaranteed him some time alone. I think he was very much an introvert, but was almost universally recognized. So anywhere he went, he was approached. But if you're in the pool, people are probably going to leave you alone. And so I think that probably guaranteed him a little solitude. So yeah, I mean, he did all of those things pretty much every day. When he traveled, he never changed his watch. Like, he would keep his watch on Pittsburgh time. So Bill Eisler, who worked with him, talked about how they were like in California and Fred's up at 4 a.m. Like, he probably was up before that, but he called Bill's hotel room at 4 a.m. and said, "I'm going to go down and swim. Do you want to come down and jog?" And Bill was like, "No, are you kidding me?" And Fred's like, "Okay, see you later," and just went off to swim. So he was, methodical to the point that it's kind of confounding to me, but I also find it really interesting. Like, I don't know if that came naturally, if he like imposed that on himself because he felt that he should, if it was something that he worked at because he saw its payoffs. I don't really know, the motivation behind it, but it clearly was something that was important to him. And, I think he pretty clearly was formed by some of his parents' discipline and some of the church ritual that he grew up with, because that was so much in his life, and that was so much in the neighborhood program and the way that he built that show as well.
And I think his childhood, based on what I have read from you, kind of led to this non-denominational approach too, because although he was Presbyterian, correct?
That's right.
He kind of approached everything, well, just non-denominational, like, just, I'm going to reach people where they are. And even in his own life, I know when you were talking about how he spoke with Officer, and I cannot.
Clemens. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's
and
okay.
I know him. He's one of my favorites. So
Yeah.
Officer Clemens, in his personal life, about his sexual orientation and what that meant, and kind of in that day and era, I took it as coaching him on how to preserve his career, but still accepted him, and always extended that invitation to, and bring your friend or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so the openness was always there and present. Was there anything more that you found in that struck you?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways that I came to think about Fred's, I don't know, his approach to lots of social issues, I think, was that he was ahead of his time, but he wasn't that far ahead. So I feel like with just about everything, he was ahead of his time on basically on issues of difference. So around race or gender or sexuality or disability, that he was so proactive and very early. I mean, from the time he started his work in 1968, about showing difference and affirming difference, and yet including sort of socioeconomic difference. But then in all of those same areas in his own life, there are places where it's clear that he stopped short of taking a risk that probably would have been the right thing to do. And of course, it's easy to say that from a lot of years later, but I also think there were places that, he did hurt people in his life, including Francois Clemens, by some of the places where I think he fell short of his own ideals on that. And yet he was out in front on so many of those issues, certainly in children's programming, of most everybody. I mean, Sesame Street was also and continues to be progressive on all of those things. But so I think it was always both, that he was working toward that broad acceptance and welcome, and he was still a product of his time and of his own specific privilege, and so yeah, I mean, it's good to remember that he was definitely not perfect. If he's perfect, then You know,
He's
we
not
don't have to be challenged by him, you know, but
That's right.
he wasn't. And I think it's good to know, you know.
And he was striving. I mean, he was always striving to do, I feel like, the right thing, or that's what I want
Yeah.
to believe. I'm going to believe that.
Yeah.
One of the things you wrote was when he was speaking in regards to how you share the kingdom of God with people. And in a former life, you know, I worked at a church, and so this kind of spoke to me in my heart. So, and you wrote, he said that it can't be simply talked about, can it? Jesus himself used parables. So I guess that's our directive, to try to show the kingdom of God through stories as much as possible. And so he kind of used this platform for him to usher in a very almost covert way. I feel like
Yeah.
people didn't really know that he was saying be kind every single day or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Um, and so I thought that was really wonderful. He just didn't want anybody to feel excluded. So that was
Right.
really great.
Yeah. 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 I mean, his faith was very important to him. It shows up in lots of his writings and in his letters and all of that. But yeah, he was a little uncomfortable with talking about it, unless he knew that the person he was talking to shared, you know, some aspects of that faith. And if it was something they wanted to talk about, great. But I think he struggled with it sometimes, and he talked about that not being easy in that letter that you referenced. But I think he sort of took the cue, whether he was aware of it or not. But you know, when I read the Gospels and read the parables, it seems to me that maybe Jesus has the same kind of struggle a little bit. That it's like he doesn't quite know how to sum it up, because he over and over again says, you know, the kingdom of God is like, and he'll tell a story, and then, you know, the next minute it's, well, the kingdom of God is like, and you know, there's even this, I think there's even a place where he says, how shall I describe it, you know. So I think there was a little bit of that Fred maybe, you know, who knows how consciously took inspiration from as well, to say all we can do is keep telling these stories and trying to capture, you know, what this is. And so he had, you know, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but particularly the neighborhood of make-believe, where he could try out these stories. And I think they were kind of covert and sometimes subversive, sometimes very daring. And I think, you know, some of it, maybe it was because it was cloaked in the kind of Mr. Rogers comfort that he could get by with it. But also sometimes I wonder, like, how much of the time am I out of the room when my kids are watching something because I need to get something done or whatever? And like, kids were watching this stuff, and I don't know how many parents even knew that he's in the next room talking about like pacifism basically or whatever.
Yes.
And you know, and he got letters. I mean, he got letters from people who did see it and appreciated it, and he got letters from people who saw it and found it, you know, objectionable. But also, like, a lot of that stuff I think went under the radar, but you know, whole generations of kids were being formed by it, and I think that's really, really fascinating too.
I know when I read your book and you referenced the bombings and how they approached that,
Yeah.
I distinctly remember going, "Oh, I watched those," and I
Really?
remember feeling uncomfortable during though, but I couldn't figure out why.
Yeah.
So I don't know. As an adult, you have that flashback, and you're like, "Oh wow, like that
Yeah.
was really,
Yeah.
really interesting." I didn't really get what he was doing, but you know.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, and I'll fill that in briefly for folks who haven't
Oh yeah.
maybe read cover to cover, but um, or watched every episode. I've not watched every episode either. But in 1983, I think, there was a 5-day series that ran, which tends to be referred to as Conflict Week. I'm not sure if that's what it was actually called at the time, but it's my favorite of all of the weeks of programming, because it was so gutsy. Like, I just can't believe that he did this. But so it was during a time when the kind of the like arms race was sort of in the news, and there were these escalating tensions in various parts of the world under the Reagan administration. And so he wrote this storyline that is just kind of stunning. And so basically what it is that in the neighborhood of make believe, where, you know, King Friday and all the puppet characters live, or Mr. Rogers himself isn't there, just in case you're not familiar with the show. But in the neighborhood of make believe, King Friday somehow hears from Cornflake especially, who's the factory owner, that he's received an order of parts, 1 million parts from the neighboring town of Southwood. And so King Friday immediately assumes that this order of 1 million parts is because Southwood wants to build bombs, because they're going to make war on the neighborhood of make-believe. I don't know why King Friday thinks this is the case, but this is sort of his personality. He's a little bit of a, I don't know. Sorry?
A little bit of an alarmist.
Yeah, he is. He is. And he's, you know, is a little used to being in charge and doesn't want to be challenged and all of that. And so King Friday responds by placing his own order. And he says, if Southwood has 1 million, we will have 1,000,001, which is amazing. So he orders 1,000,001 parts from Cornflake Especialty's factory. In the meantime, we find out that recently, because the neighborhood bank balance was doing quite well, they had convened a committee to decide on a purchase for the neighborhood school. And so Lady Elaine Fairchild, who you may remember is kind of the neighborhood troublemaker, she's in charge of the committee, and they've decided to recommend the purchase of a record player. But now, because all of the neighborhood money has been spent on 1,000,001 parts to make bombs, they can't buy the record player. So she's furious. Meanwhile, King Friday conscripts all these people from the neighborhood to go into the castle and build bombs. Like, who puts this on television in 1983? It's amazing. So they're in the castle building bombs, which I don't think we actually see, but we hear about. And then finally, Lady Aberlin, who's a human character in the neighborhood of make-believe, and Lady Elaine, who are both kind of dissidents, they decide, we're going to go find out what's actually happening. And they go to Southwood and they find out they're not building bombs, they're building a bridge, which totally blows my mind. I mean, he could have made it anything, but he chose a bridge as something that's creating connection rather than destruction. And so they go back and they tell King Friday, and he's always so apt to get things wrong, but he's always very quickly converted. Once he knows the truth, he's like, oh, how wonderful. This is much better. So they have a party with Southwood to come and celebrate the new bridge, and the bridge builder very kindly offers to take the 1,000,001 parts that have been purchased to make bombs and instead use them to build record players, which will go to every school in the world. So there's this amazing, I mean, all these things of like the money that should go to the schools is going to build bombs. I mean, it's like, it's not subtle, right? It's so daring. Anyway, and so for me, it's this amazing sort of parable of the kingdom of, you know, the kingdom of God as a place. At the end of the episode, the verse from Isaiah about beating swords into plowshares, and spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not rise up against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. That flashes up on the screen, and he doesn't attribute it. He doesn't say where it comes from, but the verse is there. And so, like, if swords can be made into plowshares, then bombs can be made into bridges. And so for him, I feel like it's this way of showing, the powerful are brought low. Like, King Friday's wrong, and the children get what they need in the end. And connection is the point more than conflict. Anyway, it's wonderful. However, the sort of catch is it ran a couple of times and then he pulled it. It was too controversial, and he decided not to air it anymore, even under pretty significant pressure from on his staff. Betty Aberlin, really thought he should air it during the Gulf War, and he wouldn't. And so it's amazing, Marcia, that you remember seeing it, because it didn't air that many times, and that it's kind of a special thing that you got to watch it.
Really, I just remember the conflict in me. Like, I thought, this is really strange, because I was young. I guess 8, and so I was just like, ugh.
Yeah.
So Spencer has a great question. Was there any subject that Fred would not address on his show for one reason or another?
Yeah. I think there were a number of places he wouldn't go. I mean, it's striking some of the things he was willing to talk about, but there were other things that he wasn't. So for instance, he was very intentional about showing racial diversity on his show, but there was some point where Betty Aberlin, who was Lady Aberlin as well as Betty, she did both on the show, and Francois Clemens, who you've alluded to, they approached Fred and said, you should do a storyline in Make Believe where we are a couple. They wanted to show an interracial couple, and he listened and thought about it, but he didn't do it. There was also a point where I'm trying to remember. I can't remember if there may have been a time when Francois Clemens I shouldn't say that because I don't know that that's true. But I do know, so there was a time when in an interview where he was talking about some of the topics that he had addressed that did kind of push, I think, what was at the time usual for children's television, doing a week on divorce and a week on death. Actually, that was quite early that he did a week on death. And even he actually thought it was kind of a big deal that he did a week on childcare, which is funny to me. But in his mind, this was one of the places where his kind of times show up. He still thought it was best if children had a mother at home. And so for him to like do a program on childcare because women were working was like, I never would have thought I'd need to do that, but I guess I need to do that. So it's interesting. But he did. But I think in an interview at some point, he talked about like, for whatever reason, he named as a, what's the word I want? A sort of theoretical, whatever. He named like, would I ever do a week on AIDS, for instance? And he said no. And I imagine that had to do with the times as well, some of the misunderstandings or some of the sort of stigma. I don't know. But I think there were some things he wasn't willing to do. And he was very aware of where the lines were. I mean, even in that conflict storyline and not being willing to re-air that, he never wanted to push it so far that parents would feel the need to not let their children watch. And at least in his way of talking about that wasn't about ratings, and it wasn't about kind of his, his reputation. It was about making sure that children could be welcomed into the neighborhood, that people didn't get excluded, and that they could receive the messages that I think were the most important to him, which were about, really were about affirmation. It was, I like you just the way you are. I mean, that was the center of everything he was doing. And so he wasn't going to take on a topic that would cause parents to not let their children hear, I like you just the way you are. That was the center for him.
Makes sense. So Faith says,
hi, Faith.
I admittedly haven't read the book yet. She's gonna. I'm convinced.
No worries.
But she's curious. What was some of your source material? Did you have access to his letters, papers, etc.? So what were some of those?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here, Faith. I wish I could see you. Yes. So I did a number of different things. So I read a bunch of books that other people wrote about Fred, often people who knew him well. I read a lot of his writings that are published in, books and things. I interviewed a bunch of people who knew him personally. And then I did go to 2 archives in Pittsburgh, one at the Fred Rogers Center, which is on the campus of St. Vincent College in Latrobe, which is his hometown. They have a ton of stuff there. And I kind of wish I could have seen more, but I couldn't just like go and rustle around. So I had to ask for things, and I asked for kind of anything related to his faith, ministry, seminary, whatever, and ended up seeing a lot of cool, stuff. I mean, I got a lot of material from there, but I always feel like I'm sure there was more that I would have loved to have gotten into. And then also at Pitt, the university, they have an archive that has a Fred Rogers collection, and I did get to get pretty much all those boxes and go through everything, but that was a little bit more like newspaper clippings and things that someone else had collected. It wasn't as much of his personal stuff, although I think that's where I found some letters from children to him and things like that. So yes, the papers were wonderful, and to me the kind of treasure was anytime I got to see something that was in his handwriting. It's very distinctive handwriting, and that was cool. It wasn't the original, but it still just felt like getting as close as I kind of could. So yeah, it was really neat, and I feel like there's an enormous amount of it. I mean, I also watched episodes of things, though not as many as there are. There's so many. So I'm sure there's a lot more that I could have found, but yeah, it was a kind of a wide range of things.
Well, we have a question from Angela.
Angela,
do you think
is my mother?
Yes.
Hi, Mom.
I was going to let her go incognito.
It's okay.
Do
It's
you
all
think
good.
Fred would have done an episode speaking to our current political conflict or division? Please.
I
I
know,
wouldn't.
right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's such a good question. I mean, so Fred was at some point, I mean, he gets cited as a registered Republican. However, as we know, some of that has changed, kind of what that means. But he was very, he clearly addressed issues that I would call political in terms of, all these issues among people, issues of difference, issues of socioeconomics and race and all sorts of things. You know, arms races and all of that. I think those count as political. But he did steer clear of being outwardly what we think of, I think, as political, that's really more like partisan. He didn't tend to take public stances that invoked like parties that were in power or specific politicians or whatever. So I think there were times that he shied away from taking some more risky stances that I think would have been in line with his belief, but that he just decided to keep more to himself. So maybe that still would have been true. On the other hand, I know that there are so many people who used to think of themselves as not that political or privately political, who now feel the need to be more outward in responding to our current political division and conflict. And maybe he would have been as well. And who knows what the impact would have been even of him living an additional, 18 or 17 or whatever years, if he would have at some point felt more like, I need to be more explicit about this. I know that around the time of like 9/11, he did some public service announcements that were short, but just kind of, I think what he tried to do was to remind the adults who grew up with him as children of what he had taught them, really about their own value. I think he believed that, he gets remembered for being all about kindness. And I think he modeled kindness. But what he said to us most often wasn't be kind, it was you are lovable. Because I think he believed that if we understood ourselves to be lovable, then we would be kind, because we wouldn't need to be taking other people down. And if we think we're lovable, then we're probably going to see other people as lovable too. So I don't know. I mean, I think he might have come at it in that kind of way of trying to remind us, people who are raising kids and grandkids now who grew up watching him. And we've seen it happen with, I heard people talk about like sitting in a theater where they just saw the trailer for the Fred Rogers movie and everybody starts to cry. I think when we encounter him, there is this kind of emotional, for those of us who grew up watching him, there's this emotional connection to that experience of feeling seen and of being affirmed. And I really think that, sorry, Mom, I'm not answering your question, but I think this, when people have asked me before, like, why do you think we are drawn to him so much now? Is it because like there's nobody like him, we wish we had him? And like, maybe, but I actually think lots of people are like Fred, and that lots of people are kind and creative and brilliant and caring. Like there are lots of those people. But what he did was he told us that we were lovable. And I think what we're afraid of right now isn't that we can't be kind. People are kind all the time. If you go to the grocery store, someone will be kind to you. I think what we're afraid of is that we're not lovable. And when we hear that, we just lose it because it's such a relief. And he evokes that for us. I don't know if he would have done an episode, Mom, sorry, but I feel like I don't think he would have been explicit about like, hey, go vote for Biden. I think he would have wanted to evoke in us our connection to affirmation of ourself and our sense of ourselves as connected in a neighborhood.
Decency.
Well, yeah. And there are certainly specific ways that his messages resonate. There's the border fence around the castle. There's, he cared, so I won't go off on too long of a tangent here, but for me over the past few years, the political issue that has felt the most like would absolutely break the heart of Fred Rogers is family separation. And it's because there's a chapter in the book, but that he had an experience when one of his sons was very young in the hospital, where his son had to have a very minor surgery, but was taken away from him and Joanne, his wife, in a way that was traumatic for his son. And he saw basically lifelong consequences for his son out of that experience of trauma. And so out of that, he dedicated so much of his work on the neighborhood and beyond it to addressing issues of separation for children. And under that heading, he would put daycare, and he would put divorce, and he would put death, as well as just the daily, like, I'll be back, that kind of separation. Like, he knew how much that could harm a child. And so I that's one of the things where I think, I don't know if he could have sat still on that, because I don't think there's any way he could have not spoken at that moment, knowing what harm that can do to a child. So I'll stop, but
I agree. I am with you on that.
Yeah.
We do have another question from Vicki, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I know we're coming to the close of our only 1 hour, which is not long enough. But Vicki says, do you know more than you put in the book about Fred's courtship to his wife?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. I mean, it's a fascinating story because I don't know much, and I wish I knew more. But basically, I mean, I'm just going to summarize what's in the book, really. But basically, they were good friends. They met when Fred visited Rollins College, where he ended up going. She was a student there already, and she was one of the students who hosted him. And they were friends all through college. But when they left, their friends kind of assumed they were each maybe in a relationship or could be with somebody else. But then they ended up keeping in touch kind of by letters and things. And at some point he wrote her a letter he was in New York and she was in a master's program for piano composition. And he wrote her a letter and proposed, and she thought about it and ran to the phone booth and called him and said yes. And that was kind of it. So yeah, I mean, it's maybe they just don't give a lot away. They're both, I think, sort of private people, but I think it was a little undefined until it wasn't, and then they were going to get married. So, but yeah, it's interesting.
Well, Shea, thank you so much for giving your time to us. It was really a joy to get to meet you and to get to know you, especially after as much time as I've spent with your book. I want to make sure that we thank St. Mark's Episcopal Church and the Betty Rowland Wittenberg Foundation for sponsoring this session. We're grateful to them for bringing you here. And I just want to a big thank you from Arkansas.
Yeah, well, thank you, Marcia.
Yeah.
And yeah, thanks to the festival and everybody who put this together. It's been a lot of fun. So thank you. And thank you all that I wish I could see you, but thanks for coming. It's fun to be in conversation.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. I'll have a good night.
Bye.